I remember the exact moment my son called me a parasite, like a punch to the gut that left me gasping for air in the cold courtroom. Everyone cracked a collective gasp, but it wasn't his words alone. It was what I revealed right after that silenced the room. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Every morning, I sat at the kitchen table, my worn, chipped porcelain mug pressing cold against my trembling hands, watching the gray New York skyline through a rain-streaked window. The steam from my coffee curled upward like the dreams I once had, now dissipating into nothing. I was 72 years old, and I felt like a ghost in my own life. My apartment in Queens had become a mausoleum of memories. The scent of stale coffee mingled with the mothball-soaked curtains I couldn't afford to replace. The radiator clanked its familiar rhythm, the only sound that acknowledged my existence. On the wall hung a faded photograph of us all at Coney Island, that bright summer day when my children's laughter filled the air, before everything cracked like old paint on weathered wood. I touched the frame with fingers that trembled from more than age. In that photo, my son Michael was 12. His gap-toothed grin stretched wide as he held a cotton candy bigger than his head. My daughter Sarah, 10 then, clutched my hand while pointing at the Ferris wheel. My husband Robert stood behind us, his strong arms wrapped around our little family, his eyes bright with hope for our future. That was 35 years ago, before the silence, before the cold shoulders, before the unanswered calls that echo in my chest like stones dropped in a well. Just yesterday morning, I had sent a text to Michael. Mother's Day was approaching, and despite everything, hope still flickered in my heart like a candle in the wind. "Happy early Mother's Day, sweetheart," I typed with careful fingers on the phone my neighbor Lily had helped me learn to use. "I love you." The message showed as delivered, then read. But no response came. Not even the courtesy of acknowledgement. I stared at that screen until my eyes burned, waiting for those 3 dots that meant he was typing back. They never appeared. This wasn't the first time. The silence had been building for months, maybe years. Phone calls that went to voicemail, invitations to family dinners that were politely declined with excuses that grew thinner each time. Birthday cards I sent that were never mentioned, as if they had disappeared into some void where my love no longer mattered. I set the phone down on the scratched wooden table where I ate my meals alone. The apartment felt smaller every day, the walls pressing in like the weight of my children's indifference. Through the thin walls, I could hear the Rodriguez family next door preparing breakfast, their laughter and chatter in Spanish reminding me what a home filled with love sounded like. Standing slowly, my arthritis protesting the movement, I walked to the window overlooking the busy street below. Queens Boulevard stretched out like a river of rushing cars and hurried pedestrians. Everyone with somewhere important to be, someone important to see. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and wondered when I had become invisible, even to the people I had given my whole life to create. The morning routine continued as it had for months. I would shuffle to the bathroom, avoiding my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. The woman looking back at me had become a stranger, gray hair that had lost its curl, eyes that held too much sadness, shoulders bent from carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. I would make my tea, Earl Grey, the same brand I had served my children when they were small and sick with colds. I would sit in Robert's old chair, the one that still held his shape though he had been gone for 2 years now. The silence would settle around me like dust, broken only by the television programs I watched without really seeing, their laugh tracks mocking my solitude. But this morning was different. As I reached for the mail that had been pushed under my door, an envelope caught my attention. Official-looking, with my lawyer's return address. My hands shook as I opened it, remembering that I hadn't requested any legal documents. The words swam before my eyes as I read. Account transfers, authorization requests, documents bearing my signature that I had never signed. My son's name appeared throughout the papers, along with banking information I didn't recognize, accounts I had never opened, transfers I had never approved. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. Someone had been using my name, my identity, to move money I couldn't afford to lose. I sank into Robert's chair, the papers fluttering to the floor like leaves in autumn. My breathing became shallow, my chest tight with the weight of betrayal. The son I had carried for 9 months, nursed through countless sleepless nights, worked double shifts to put through college. Was he stealing from me? The memories came flooding back then, each one sharper than broken glass. Every time Michael had called asking for money over the years, his voice always carried that tone, casual, expecting, as if my bank account existed solely for his convenience. "Mom, can you help me out this month? The rent's due and I'm a little short." His voice through the phone, distracted, already assuming my answer would be yes. And it always was yes. Even when my own grocery budget was stretched thin, even when I had to choose between my medication and his requests, even when my electricity bill went unpaid so he could make his car payment. "Just this once," he would promise. "I'll pay you back next month." But next month never came. The repayments were forgotten as quickly as the requests were made. And like a fool, I enabled it, telling myself that this was what mothers did. We sacrificed. We gave until we had nothing left to give, and then we found a way to give more. Sarah was quieter about her needs, but no less expectant. She would visit occasionally, usually when she needed something, a co-signature on a loan, help with her daughter's school tuition, money for a small emergency that somehow required amounts that made my fixed income tremble. "You know we love you, Mom," she would say, her hand briefly touching mine across the kitchen table. "We just need a little help getting on our feet." But they had been getting on their feet for 20 years now. Their feet were firmly planted on ground I had helped them buy, in homes I had helped them afford, living lives I had made possible through decades of sacrifice. I remembered the winter of 2019, when Robert first started showing signs of confusion. The diagnosis came in the spring. Alzheimer's, the doctor said with clinical gentleness. Early stages, but progressing. Michael's response was to suggest we look into facilities. Sarah agreed, nodding sympathetically while calculating the cost of private care versus the value of our assets. Neither offered to help with the day-to-day reality of watching the man I loved disappear piece by piece. I became a caregiver overnight, learning to administer medications, to handle the moments when Robert didn't recognize me, to clean up accidents with patience and dignity. My children would call occasionally, asking how Dad was doing, but their concern felt performative, like actors reading lines they didn't quite believe. "You're so strong, Mom," Sarah would say. "I don't know how you do it." But she never offered to find out firsthand. Never volunteered to stay with him for an afternoon so I could go to my own doctor's appointments. Never suggested that perhaps their 68-year-old mother might need some support too. The isolation during those years was complete. Friends drifted away, partly because Robert's condition made social situations difficult, partly because I was too exhausted and too proud to reach out. My world shrank to the size of our apartment, to the routine of meals and medications and managing the slow dissolution of the partnership that had defined my adult life. When Robert died in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in February, I called my children first. Michael's response was immediate concern about the funeral arrangements, the costs, the paperwork. Sarah cried appropriately but quickly shifted to practical matters. Both were present for the service, playing their parts as grieving children, accepting condolences with the right mix of sorrow and gratitude. But after the last casserole dish was returned and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, they disappeared again. The weekly check-in calls dwindled to monthly, then sporadic. My grief became another inconvenience in their busy lives, something to be managed rather than shared. I learned to cry quietly so the neighbors wouldn't hear. I learned to eat dinner at 5 o'clock because the evening felt so long otherwise. I learned to fill the silence with television programs and radio shows, voices that kept me company without expecting anything in return. The financial requests continued, though. If anything, they increased after Robert's death. Perhaps they assumed his small life insurance policy had left me flush with extra cash. Perhaps they believed widowhood had made me more vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Perhaps they simply didn't care about my circumstances as long as I remained useful. "Mom, I know this is a hard time," Michael said during one of his rare calls, "but I'm in a real bind here. Could you help me out with just $5,000? I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." $5,000. More than I spent on groceries in 6 months. More than my monthly Social Security check. But the tone in his voice suggested that my answer was already assumed, that my financial situation was irrelevant to his needs. I helped him out, of course. I always helped them out, even when it meant delaying necessary repairs to my apartment, even when it meant choosing generic medications over brand names, even when it meant lying awake at night wondering how I would pay my own bills. The requests came with increasing frequency and decreasing gratitude. What had once been accompanied by promises of repayment now arrived with explanations of why repayment wasn't possible. What had once been prefaced with apology now arrived as if I owed them my resources as payment for having been their mother. "You don't understand how expensive things are now," Sarah would say when I hesitantly mentioned my own budget constraints. "We've got real responsibilities. Adult responsibilities." As if raising them hadn't been a real responsibility. As if caring for their father through his final illness hadn't been an adult responsibility. As if living on a fixed income while watching my children live increasingly comfortable lives wasn't its own kind of challenge. I began to wonder if they saw me as anything more than a bank account with a pulse. Our conversations revolved entirely around their needs, their problems, their financial pressures. When I tried to share my own concerns, the leaky ceiling in my bathroom, the rising cost of my medications, the loneliness that sat on my chest like a weight, their responses were perfunctory, distracted. "That's tough, Mom. Listen, I've got to run, but we'll talk soon, okay?" But soon never came unless they needed something. Last year, the pattern reached a breaking point I didn't even recognize at the time. It was my 71st birthday, a milestone I had been quietly dreading because Robert wouldn't be there to acknowledge it. I stayed close to the phone all day, expecting calls that didn't come. I checked my mailbox twice, looking for cards that weren't there. By evening, I realized the day would pass unmarked by my children. No calls, no cards, no acknowledgement that the woman who had given them life had successfully completed another year of her own. I sat in Robert's chair and cried until I had no tears left. Not because I needed a celebration. I was long past expecting parties or presents. But because the silence felt like erasure, as if my existence mattered so little that even the day of my birth could pass unnoticed. 2 days later, Michael called. Not to apologize or explain, but to ask if I could help him with his mortgage payment. He was cheerful, casual, as if nothing had happened. As if forgetting his mother's birthday was such a minor oversight that it didn't warrant mention. I helped him with the mortgage payment. The isolation deepened through the winter months. My arthritis made the cold more painful, and I spent most days wrapped in the Afghan Robert's sister had knitted for us as a wedding gift. The heating bill strained my budget, but I was too proud to mention this to my children, afraid they would suggest I move to a smaller place, or, worse, some kind of senior living facility. When I caught a cold that winter, it settled in my chest and refused to leave. The cough kept me awake at night and my breathing became labored. I knew I should see a doctor, but the copay felt too expensive, and the effort of getting to an appointment seemed overwhelming. The cold became bronchitis, then pneumonia. I was sick for weeks, struggling to breathe, too weak to prepare proper meals. I called Michael once, hoping he might offer to pick up groceries or even just check on me by phone more frequently. "That's rough, Mom," he said, his attention clearly elsewhere. "Make sure you're drinking plenty of fluids. I've got to go. I'm late for a meeting." Sarah's response was similar: sympathy without action, concern without commitment. I recovered slowly, alone, living on crackers and canned soup, wondering what would have happened if I had been too sick to care for myself. Who would have found me? How long would it have taken? The fear of my own vulnerability began to keep me awake at nights. I was getting older, more fragile, more dependent on systems that felt increasingly unreliable. My children had made it clear that they saw me as a resource rather than a person, someone to provide support rather than someone who might someday need support herself. I began to understand, with painful clarity, that I had raised children who felt entitled to my sacrifices but not responsible for my welfare. They expected me to be eternally available for their needs while remaining conveniently invisible when it came to my own. Spring arrived late that year, and with it came a day that would change everything. I was dusting the old cabinet where I kept Robert's papers, insurance documents, tax records, things I rarely needed to access. My arthritic fingers brushed against an envelope I didn't recognize, tucked behind a file folder labeled Important Documents. The envelope was thick, official, addressed to my lawyer with a return address I didn't recognize. My name was typed across the front, but I had no memory of requesting any legal correspondence. With shaking hands, I opened it. The contents made no sense at first. Bank statements for accounts I had never opened. Transfer authorizations bearing my signature, but a signature that looked wrong, traced rather than natural. Asset movement forms that moved money from accounts I did recognize to accounts I didn't. And there, on document after document, was Michael's name, listed as the beneficiary. The recipient, the authorized agent for transactions I had never approved. I read through the papers 3 times before the full scope of what I was seeing became clear. Someone had been systematically moving my assets. The small savings account Robert and I had built over decades. The life insurance money that was supposed to ensure my security in old age. Even the tiny pension fund from my years as a secretary. The amounts were staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars, moved in careful increments over the past year. Money that would have paid for better health care, home improvements, perhaps even a small vacation to somewhere warm during the harsh Queen's winters. Money that had been taken without my knowledge or consent. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor of the living room, the papers scattered around me like evidence of a crime I was only beginning to understand. The realization wasn't just financial, it was emotional, spiritual. The son I had carried in my body, nurtured with my own strength, sacrificed for throughout his entire life, was stealing from me. Not just asking for help, not just taking advantage of my generosity. Actually forging documents and stealing money from his elderly mother. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I couldn't process it all at once. I sat on that floor for hours, picking up papers and setting them down, reading the same sentences over and over, trying to make them mean something other than what they clearly meant. As the afternoon faded into evening, a new emotion began to emerge beneath the shock and hurt. Anger. Real anger. The kind I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. The kind I had been trained out of feeling by decades of being told that good mothers don't get angry, that family loyalty means accepting whatever treatment you receive with grace and forgiveness. But this was theft. Criminal behavior. And the victim was a 71-year-old widow who had already given everything she could afford to give and more than she should have given. I pulled myself up from the floor, my knees protesting but my spine straightening with newfound resolve. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I was going to say no. I was going to fight back. I was going to demand answers and accountability and basic human respect. The next morning, I called the legal aid clinic in Manhattan that I had heard advertised on the radio. My voice shook as I explained my situation to the intake worker, but I forced myself to continue, to give the details I had spent a lifetime minimizing or excuse-making. Mrs. Martinez, the young lawyer said when we met the following week. What you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse. This is not a family dispute. This is a crime. Hearing the words spoken aloud by someone else made them real in a way they hadn't been when I whispered them to myself in the dark. Financial elder abuse. Crime. My son wasn't just ungrateful or selfish. He was a criminal who had targeted his own mother. The lawyer, Janet, was patient and kind, explaining my options in language I could understand. We could seek a restraining order to prevent further unauthorized access to my accounts. We could pursue criminal charges. We could demand full restitution of the stolen funds. But Mrs. Martinez, she said gently, I need you to understand that pursuing this legally will likely mean the end of your relationship with your son. Are you prepared for that possibility? I thought about Michael's face in that Coney Island photograph, his gap-toothed grin and bright eyes. I thought about the baby I had rocked through countless nights, the toddler whose skinned knees I had kissed, the young man whose college graduation had filled me with such pride. Then I thought about the forged signatures on those bank documents. I thought about the months I had gone without proper medical care, so I could afford to help him with his emergencies. I thought about my 71st birthday, passing unmarked and unacknowledged while he lived comfortably on money stolen from my future. Janet, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. I think that relationship ended some time ago. I just didn't want to admit it. The legal process moved quickly once we filed the initial paperwork. Account freezes were put in place to prevent further theft. A restraining order was issued requiring Michael to stay away from my financial institutions. Documentation was gathered to support both civil and criminal charges. Michael's response, when he was served with the legal notices, was immediate and predictable. Denial, justified by righteous indignation. How could I do this to him? How could I accuse my own son of theft? Didn't I understand that he had only been trying to help manage my finances? Sarah called, crying, asking how I could tear the family apart over money. Over money? As if the issue was greed rather than theft. As if I were the one who had violated trust and broken faith. Mom, he's your son, she said, her voice pleading. Whatever happened, we can work it out. You don't need lawyers and courts. We're family. But we hadn't been family in any meaningful sense for years. We had been an elaborate pretense of family, held together by my willingness to give and their willingness to take. The moment I stopped giving, the moment I demanded basic honesty and respect, the pretense collapsed entirely. The court date was scheduled for early summer. In the weeks leading up to it, I experienced something I hadn't felt in decades: peace. Not happiness exactly, but the deep calm that comes from finally telling the truth after years of denial and self-deception. I slept through the night for the first time in months. I woke up each morning with purpose instead of dread. I bought groceries without calculating how much money I could spare for Michael's next emergency. I paid my bills on time without wondering if I would have enough left over to help Sarah with her latest financial crisis. For the first time since Robert's death, I began to imagine a future that belonged to me. The morning of the court hearing, I dressed carefully in my best suit, navy blue, purchased for Robert's funeral, but appropriate for this occasion as well. It was, in its way, another funeral, the burial of illusions I had kept alive far too long. Janet met me at the courthouse, an imposing building in downtown Manhattan that made me feel very small and very old. But as we walked through the marble corridors, my steps became steadier, my breathing more even. I was here to tell the truth. After decades of enablement and excuse-making, I was finally going to tell the truth. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. but formal in a way that made the proceedings feel important. Michael sat with his lawyer at one table, avoiding my eyes. Sarah was there too, in the gallery, her face a mask of hurt and accusation. When my turn came to testify, I stood slowly and walked to the witness stand. The judge, a woman about Sarah's age, looked at me with professional kindness as I was sworn in. "Mrs. Martinez," Janet began, "please tell the court about your relationship with your son, Michael." I had prepared for this moment, but the words still came slowly at first. I told them about the decades of financial support, the requests that became demands, the promises of repayment that were never kept. I told them about Robert's illness and death, about my own health struggles, about the isolation that had made me vulnerable to manipulation. Then I told them about the forged documents, about the unauthorized account transfers, about money taken from a widow's modest savings without her knowledge or consent. My voice grew stronger as I continued, the facts speaking for themselves in their stark clarity. Michael's lawyer tried to paint the thefts as misunderstandings, as an adult child trying to help his elderly mother manage her finances, but the evidence was overwhelming. Signatures that didn't match, transfers made without my knowledge, accounts opened in my name without my authorization. When Michael finally took the stand, his strategy became clear. He was going to portray me as a burden, a woman whose demands for money had forced him to take desperate measures. He was going to make himself the victim of my needs rather than the perpetrator of my abuse. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying that tone of long-suffering patience I remembered from his childhood. "My mother has always been very demanding when it comes to money. She expects us to support her lifestyle, to pay for things she can't afford. I was trying to help her manage her finances more efficiently." The courtroom was silent as he continued, each word a knife thrust into whatever remained of our relationship. "She calls constantly, asking for things. Money for groceries, money for bills, money for medical expenses. She acts like we owe her something just because she's our mother. It's been going on for years, and honestly, it's exhausting." I stared at him from the gallery, this man who had been my baby, my little boy, my son. The lies came so easily to him, delivered with such conviction, that for a moment I wondered if he actually believed them. Then came the word that would echo in my mind for months afterward. "Your Honor," Michael said, his voice rising with artificial emotion. "My mother has become a parasite. She has used guilt and manipulation to drain our family financially and emotionally. I was only trying to protect my own family from her demands." A parasite. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. I felt it enter my chest like a blade, not because it was true, but because it revealed the depth of his contempt for me. In his mind, the woman who had given him life, who had sacrificed her own comfort and security for his benefit, was nothing more than a drain on his resources. The collective gasp from the courtroom gallery was audible. Even Michael's lawyer looked uncomfortable with the term. The judge's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something approaching disgust. But I felt strangely calm in that moment, because his words had finally torn away the last pretense, the final illusion. There was no going back from calling your mother a parasite in open court. There was no relationship to preserve or protect. I stood up slowly, my arthritis forgotten in the clarity of the moment. Janet looked at me with concern, unsure why I was rising from my seat. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "I have something I need to say." The judge nodded for me to continue. Michael turned to look at me, his face flushing as he realized that his strategy, painting me as a burden, had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. "My son has called me a parasite," I said, each word deliberate and clear. "But I think the court should know about the trust." Janet looked at me in confusion. We hadn't discussed any trust. But I had made a decision in that moment, a decision born of decades of silence and enablement that were finally ending. 20 years ago, I continued, when my husband and I realized we needed to plan for our future, we established a trust that was designed to ensure our children's financial security after we were gone. The courtroom was completely silent now. Michael's face had gone pale. That trust, Your Honor, contains nearly $500,000. Money my husband and I saved over 40 years of marriage. Money we plan to leave to our children because we believed they would be grateful for our sacrifices, that they would honor our memory. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I had prepared the night before, working by lamplight at my kitchen table as I made the most important decision of my life. But a parasite, Your Honor, doesn't leave an inheritance to her host. A burden doesn't provide for the people who call her a burden. I handed the folder to Janet, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside were the documents I had prepared, forms to dissolve the trust, to redirect its assets to charities that served elderly people, to ensure that Michael would never benefit from the money he had already tried to steal. I am changing my will, changing the trust, removing both of my children as beneficiaries. Every dollar that would have been theirs will instead go to organizations that help elderly people who are being abused by their own families. The courtroom erupted. Sarah began to cry loudly. Michael's lawyer was frantically whispering to him. The judge was calling for order. But in the center of the chaos, I felt perfectly calm. For the first time in years, my actions matched my words. For the first time in decades, I was protecting myself instead of protecting my children from the consequences of their choices. The judge awarded me full restitution for the stolen funds and granted the restraining orders Janet had requested. But more importantly, I had finally found my voice. I had finally said no. I had finally chosen my own dignity over their comfort. As I left the courthouse that day, walking slowly down the marble steps into the bright Manhattan sunlight, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert's death: hope. The immediate aftermath of the court hearing was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. Michael hired a public relations consultant, paid for, I assume, with money he had stolen from me, to craft a narrative that portrayed me as a vindictive old woman who had turned against her loving family over a simple misunderstanding. Within days, the story appeared on social media, carefully crafted to make him appear sympathetic and me appear unstable. According to his version of events, I was suffering from age-related cognitive decline that made me paranoid and irrational. He was a devoted son trying to help his confused mother, only to be falsely accused of crimes he would never commit. The online response was swift and predictably divided. Strangers who knew nothing about my life felt qualified to judge my choices, to diagnose my mental state, to decide whether my actions were justified or cruel. How could a mother do this to her own child over money? One comment read, "There's always two sides to every story. This sounds like dementia to me," said another. Elder abuse is real, but so is elder paranoia. Someone needs to do a welfare check on this woman. Reading those comments late at night, alone in my Queens apartment, I felt the familiar urge to defend myself, to explain, to justify my choices to people who had already decided I was wrong. The old Margaret would have called Michael, would have offered to make peace, would have sacrificed her dignity to restore the appearance of family harmony. But I wasn't the old Margaret anymore. Instead, I closed the laptop and made myself a cup of tea. I sat in Robert's chair and looked out at the city lights, thinking about truth and justice and the difference between being alone and being lonely. The hardest part wasn't the stranger's judgment. It was the silence from people who had known me for decades. Friends from church who suddenly seemed too busy to chat after service. Neighbors who had once stopped to talk in the hallway, but now hurried past with awkward smiles. The implicit message was clear. Whatever Michael had done, mothers were supposed to forgive and forget, not drag their children into court. Sarah tried to play mediator, calling to suggest family counseling, begging me to work things out for the sake of maintaining relationships. Her approach was more sophisticated than Michael's public campaign, but equally manipulative. "Mom, I know you're hurt," she would say, her voice carefully calibrated to sound reasonable and concerned. "But Michael made a mistake. He's learned his lesson. Can't we find a way to move past this?" A mistake. As if systematic theft over the course of a year could be dismissed as a momentary lapse in judgment. As if forging my signature and stealing my retirement savings were equivalent to forgetting to call on my birthday. "Sarah," I finally said during one of these calls, "if someone who wasn't related to you stole $50,000 from your bank account, would you call it a mistake?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. But the isolation wasn't complete. Janet, my lawyer, checked on me regularly, not just as a client, but as a person she had come to respect. The intake worker at the legal aid clinic sent me information about support groups for elderly people who had experienced financial abuse. These strangers showed more genuine concern for my welfare than my own children had demonstrated in years. And then there was Lily. I had mentioned her briefly during the court proceedings, describing her as the neighbor's granddaughter who sometimes visited me. What I hadn't fully explained was how important those visits had become, how much light she brought into days that had grown very dark. Lily was 23, working as a nurse at a hospital in Mount Sinai while saving money to go back to school. She lived with her grandmother, Mrs. Chen, in the apartment next to mine. Their walls must have been thin because during the worst nights of my isolation, I could hear them talking and laughing together, the sounds of a relationship built on mutual affection rather than obligation. Mrs. Chen had introduced us one afternoon when Lily was visiting. "This is my granddaughter," she said with obvious pride. "She works very hard, but she always has time for her family." The implicit contrast wasn't lost on me, but Lily herself was oblivious to any awkwardness. She was curious about my life, asking about my work as a secretary, about what Queens was like when I first moved here, about the changes I had seen in the neighborhood over the decades. Her questions weren't the polite small talk that passes for conversation with most young people. She seemed genuinely interested in my experiences, in the stories I had to tell. When I mentioned that I had trouble using my smartphone, she offered to teach me. When I admitted that I sometimes forgot to eat regular meals, she started bringing me homemade soup from her grandmother's kitchen. These weren't grand gestures or dramatic interventions. They were small acts of kindness from someone who saw me as a person worth knowing, rather than a problem to be solved or a resource to be exploited. After the court hearing, when my own children were treating me like a traitor and my longtime friends were keeping their distance, Lily's visits became even more precious. She would stop by after her shifts at the hospital, still wearing her scrubs, bringing stories about her patients and asking about my day. "Mrs. Martinez," she said one evening, settling into the chair across from me with a cup of the tea I had learned to make the way her grandmother did. "You seem different lately." Lighter somehow. I looked at this young woman who barely knew me but saw me more clearly than the children I had raised. How could I explain that losing my family had somehow helped me find myself? "I've been making some changes," I said finally. "Standing up for myself in ways I never did before." She nodded thoughtfully. "My grandmother says that sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who make it hardest for us to love ourselves." Mrs. Chen was wise. And her granddaughter was proof that families could be built on respect and genuine affection rather than guilt and obligation. Watching them together, I began to imagine what my own life might look like if I filled it with people who actually wanted to be there. That summer, I took my first solo trip in 40 years. I had never traveled alone. First, I had been Robert's wife, then Michael and Sarah's mother, always defining myself through my relationships to other people. But with my finances secured and my legal affairs settled, I decided to use some of the recovered money for something purely selfish. A week at a small bed and breakfast in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. The decision felt terrifyingly radical. What if I got sick? What if something happened to my apartment while I was gone? What if I hated being alone with my thoughts for an entire week? But the alternative, staying in Queens, sitting in Robert's chair, waiting for phone calls that would never come, felt like a kind of death. I booked the trip through a travel agent, an older woman who specialized in solo travel for seniors. She understood my anxieties and helped me choose a place that felt safe, but not institutional, a restored Victorian house on Seneca Lake, run by a couple who had been hosting guests for 20 years. The morning I left for my trip, I felt like I was 17 again, leaving home for the first time. My suitcase was small. I had learned to live with less over the past year, but it contained things I wanted rather than things I needed. A novel I had been meaning to read. A sketch pad, because I had loved drawing before I became too busy taking care of everyone else. Comfortable walking shoes for exploring places I had never seen. Lily helped me carry my bag to the taxi, giving me a hug that felt more maternal than any interaction I had had with my own daughter in years. "Have an adventure, Mrs. Martinez," she said as the cab pulled away. "You deserve it." Ours? The bed and breakfast was everything the travel agent had promised. Peaceful, comfortable, and populated by other people who had chosen to spend their time there. The couple who ran it, Tom and Ellen, treated their guests like family in the best sense of the word, attentive without being intrusive, welcoming without expecting anything in return. My room overlooked the lake, and I spent the first morning of my vacation sitting by the window with coffee and the novel I had packed, watching the water change colors as the sun moved across the sky. The silence wasn't the oppressive quiet of my Queens apartment, but the rich stillness of a place where I could think clearly for the first time in years. I took long walks along the lake shore, discovering muscles I had forgotten I had. I ate meals in the dining room with other guests, contributing to conversations about travel and books and current events, topics that had nothing to do with anyone's financial problems or emotional needs. On the third day, I found myself sketching again. My hands were stiff with arthritis, and my drawings were clumsy compared to the work I had done decades earlier. But the act of creating something, of translating what I saw into lines on paper, felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had thought was lost forever. That evening, I called Lily from the bed and breakfast sitting room. "Mrs. Martinez." Her voice was bright with genuine pleasure. "How's your trip? Are you having fun?" Fun. When was the last time someone had asked if I was having fun? When was the last time fun had been a priority in my life? "I am," I said, surprised by the truth of it. "I really am. I forgot what it felt like to do something just because I wanted to do it." "What's the best part so far?" I thought about the question seriously. The lake was beautiful. The food was excellent. The other guests were interesting company. But the best part was harder to define. "The quiet," I said finally. Not the lonely kind of quiet, but the peaceful kind. The kind where you can hear yourself think. When I returned to Queens the following week, something fundamental had shifted. My apartment looked the same, but I saw it differently. Instead of a place where I waited for other people to contact me, it became a place I was happy to return to. Instead of a shrine to relationships that no longer existed, it became a space that belonged entirely to me. I started making changes immediately. I replaced the faded curtains that had hung in the living room for 15 years with bright yellow fabric that let in more light. I bought new dishes to replace the chipped set Robert and I had received as a wedding gift, plates and bowls in colors that made me happy rather than pieces that carried too much history. I rearranged the furniture, moving Robert's chair out of its position facing the television and placing it by the window where the morning light was best. I turned that corner into a reading nook, adding a small table for my tea and a basket for the books I was finally making time to enjoy. The photograph from Coney Island came down from the wall. Not thrown away, I wasn't ready for that level of finality. but carefully placed in a drawer with other mementos from a life that no longer defined me. In its place, I hung a watercolor painting I had bought at the bed and breakfast, a simple landscape that reminded me of the peace I had found by the lake. Lily noticed the changes immediately when she stopped by for her weekly visit. "Mrs. Martinez, this place looks completely different. I love what you've done with the living room." "I'm trying to make it more mine," I said, pouring tea into my new yellow cups. For years, everything in here was about other people. Robert's chair, photos of the kids, furniture we chose together. I realized I didn't know what I liked when I was the only one whose opinion mattered. She nodded thoughtfully. "It feels lighter in here, more alive." That was exactly right. The apartment still contained my memories, but it was no longer a museum to my past. It was becoming a home for my present, a place where I could imagine a future that belonged to me. The changes weren't just cosmetic. I joined a senior center that offered art classes, remembering how much I had enjoyed drawing during my week at the lake. The instructor, a patient woman in her 60s who had been a professional artist before retirement, encouraged my rusty skills and introduced me to other forms of creative expression. I made friends in that class, women and men who, like me, had spent decades focused on other people's needs and were finally exploring their own interests. We would go for coffee after class, sharing stories about our adult children, our late spouses, our struggles with aging and independence. These conversations were revelatory. I learned that I wasn't the only one who had experienced financial abuse from adult children. I wasn't the only one whose family treated me like an obligation rather than a person. I wasn't the only one who had been made to feel guilty for having needs of my own. "My daughter acts like I'm being selfish when I spend money on myself," said Rose, a woman whose situation echoed my own. "But she has no problem asking me to pay for her family's vacations." "My son expects me to babysit his kids every weekend for free," added Patricia. "But when I needed help after my surgery, he was too busy to even visit." These weren't bitter complaints or attempts to compete for the title of most abused parent. They were honest acknowledgments of a shared experience, the realization that we had been conditioned to accept treatment we would never tolerate from anyone else, simply because it came from family. More importantly, we were building new relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. When Rose had a minor medical procedure, the rest of us took turns checking on her. When Patricia's car broke down, we arranged a carpool system to ensure she could still get to class. When I mentioned that I was thinking about taking another solo trip, they celebrated my independence rather than questioning my decision. These friendships filled needs I hadn't even realized I had. The need to be useful in ways that were appreciated, the need to give and receive support that wasn't taken for granted, the need to be seen as a person with interests and opinions rather than just a source of resources. Michael and Sarah continued their campaign to portray me as an unstable old woman who had inexplicably turned against her loving family. But their efforts had less impact now that I had other people in my life who could witness my actual mental state and behavior. "You seem like the sanest person I know," said Frank, a widower in my art class who had become a close friend. "Whatever your kids are saying about you, they're not talking about the woman I see every week." Having that external validation, from people who had no agenda beyond friendship, made it easier to resist the gaslighting that had been such a constant part of my relationship with my children. When Sarah called to suggest I might benefit from a mental health evaluation, I could hang up the phone and immediately call friends who treated me like a competent adult. Fall arrived with a brilliance that reminded me why I loved living in New York. The changing leaves transformed even Queens Boulevard into something beautiful, and I found myself taking longer walks, exploring neighborhoods I had lived near for decades but never really seen. On one of these walks, I discovered a small cafe that specialized in international cuisines. The owner, a woman from El Salvador, recognized me as a regular customer and began recommending dishes based on my preferences. Her kindness was casual, unforced. the sort of pleasant interaction that makes daily life richer without requiring emotional investment. These small pleasures accumulated into something approaching happiness. Not the desperate joy that comes from crisis resolution, but the quiet satisfaction of a life lived on one's own terms. I was sleeping well, eating regularly, managing my finances without stress or guilt. For the first time since Robert's death, I was looking forward to the holidays. This might seem like a small thing, but it represented a fundamental shift in my relationship with time itself. For years, holidays had been sources of anxiety. Would my children visit? Would they call? Would I spend another Christmas alone, pretending not to care while my heart broke with loneliness? Now I was making plans that didn't depend on anyone else's choices. I booked a Christmas dinner at a restaurant that specialized in holiday meals for people dining alone. Not sadly, but by choice. I signed up for a New Year's Eve celebration at the senior center. I bought presents for Lily and Mrs. Chen, for my friends from art class, for people who had earned a place in my life through kindness rather than biology. The legal resolution of Michael's theft had taken months to finalize, but by November, the last of the paperwork was complete. The money he had stolen was returned to my accounts, along with additional funds to cover legal expenses and penalties. More importantly, the restraining order remained in place, ensuring that he could not access my financial information in the future. Janet, my lawyer, had become more than a legal advocate. She was a friend who understood the complexity of my situation, the grief of losing children who were still alive, the relief of escaping abuse that had been disguised as family obligation. "Mrs. Martinez," she said during our final official meeting, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. It takes tremendous courage to do what you did, especially at your age, especially when everyone was telling you to just keep the peace." "I spent 70 years keeping other people's peace," I replied. "I think it's time I found some of my own." The holidays passed more peacefully than I had dared to hope. Christmas morning, instead of waiting by the phone for calls that wouldn't come, I woke up early and went to volunteer at a soup kitchen in Manhattan. Serving meals to homeless people, many of them older adults who had been abandoned by their own families, I felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with being taken advantage of. Lily and her grandmother invited me to their New Year's celebration, a small gathering of neighbors from our building. It was the first time in years that I had been included in something simply because people enjoyed my company, rather than because I was someone's mother or wife. As midnight approached, we stood on Mrs. Chen's balcony, watching fireworks over the Manhattan skyline. The city spread out below us like a carpet of lights, full of possibilities I was finally old enough and brave enough to explore. "What's your resolution for the new year, Mrs. Martinez?" Lily asked as we raised our glasses of sparkling cider. I thought about the question seriously. For decades, my resolutions had been about other people. Being a better wife, a more generous mother, a more patient caregiver. This year, for the first time, I wanted to make promises to myself. "I want to keep learning new things," I said finally. "I want to travel more. I want to make art and friends and memories that belong to me." "Those are beautiful goals," Mrs. Chen said, her accent soft, but her words clear. "In my country, we say that every ending is also a beginning. You have ended one life. Now you begin another." She was right. The woman who had stood in that courtroom and listened to her son call her a parasite was gone. The woman who had accepted financial abuse because she was afraid of being alone had disappeared. The woman who had apologized for having needs of her own was no more. In their place stood someone I was still getting to know, a person with preferences and boundaries, someone capable of both solitude and friendship, a woman who could choose how to spend her time and energy based on what brought her joy rather than what others expected from her. Spring came early that year, and with it came an unexpected phone call. Not from Michael or Sarah, the restraining order had ensured their silence, but from my lawyer. "Mrs. Martinez, Janet said. "I have some news that might interest you. The charity organizations that received your trust money want to invite you to their annual donor appreciation event. They'd like to thank you personally for your contribution." The event was held at a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, a beautiful space filled with people who dedicated their lives to serving elderly adults who had been abused, neglected, or abandoned by their families. Representatives from senior centers, legal aid organizations, and support groups told stories about the clients they served, people whose experiences mirrored my own. "Because of donations like Mrs. Martinez's," one speaker said, "we've been able to expand our financial abuse prevention program to help over 300 seniors this year. Many of them are now living independently and safely, protected from family members who saw them as sources of money rather than people deserving respect." Sitting in that ballroom, listening to those stories, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: pride. Not pride in my children's accomplishments, not pride in my husband's career, but pride in my own choices. The money that Michael had tried to steal, the inheritance he had felt entitled to, was now helping people who truly needed support. After the ceremony, I was approached by several of the social workers and activists who had benefited from the trust funds. "Mrs. Martinez," said a young man who worked with elderly people experiencing financial abuse, "I hope you know that your courage in pursuing legal action against your son has inspired other people to speak up about their own situations. We've had several clients mention your case as giving them hope that they could fight back too." I hadn't thought about my story as inspirational. It had felt like survival, like the desperate actions of someone who had finally run out of other options. But hearing that my experience had helped other people find their own strength gave new meaning to everything I had endured. That night, back in my bright apartment with its yellow curtains and personal touches, I called Lily to tell her about the event. "Mrs. Martinez, that's incredible. You must feel so proud of what you've accomplished." "I do," I said, surprised by the truth of it. "For the first time in my life, I feel proud of myself." Summer arrived with a heat wave that sent most of Queens running for air conditioning, but I found I didn't mind the warmth. I had energy I hadn't possessed in years, enthusiasm for projects and adventures that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or approval. I signed up for a senior travel group that took monthly trips to museums, historical sites, and cultural events throughout the New York area. The other members became casual friends, people to share experiences with, to laugh with, to explore new places alongside. We visited the Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side, learning about immigrants who had built lives in New York with nothing but hope and determination. We took a day trip to Cold Spring, walking along the Hudson River and browsing antique shops filled with treasures that reminded me of my grandmother's house. We attended a matinee performance of a Broadway show, something I had never done because Robert wasn't interested in theater and my children were too busy with their own lives. Each of these experiences added layers to my sense of self. I wasn't just Margaret Martinez, former wife and mother. I was someone who loved history, who enjoyed live music, who could strike up conversations with strangers and learn about their lives and perspectives. The second anniversary of Robert's death passed quietly that year, marked by reflection rather than devastation. I visited his grave in the morning, bringing fresh flowers and spending a few minutes talking to him about the changes in my life. "I think you'd be proud of me," I told his headstone. "I know you worried about what would happen to me after you were gone. I worried too. But I'm stronger than either of us realized." In the afternoon, I had lunch with my art class friends, sharing stories about Robert that focused on happy memories, rather than the sadness of his illness and death. They listened with the kind of attention that comes from genuine care rather than obligation, offering their own memories of lost spouses and the long process of learning to live alone without being lonely. That evening, I called Janet to discuss something I had been considering for months. "I've been thinking about writing down my story," I told her. "Not for publication necessarily, but for other people who might be going through similar situations. People who need to know they're not alone, that they can fight back, that there's life after family betrayal. Mrs. Martinez, I think that's a wonderful idea. You have a unique perspective, someone who went through the legal process and came out stronger on the other side. That could be incredibly valuable to other people. The idea of writing my story felt both terrifying and exciting. I had never thought of myself as someone with anything important to say. But the responses I had received from other seniors who had heard about my case suggested that my experience might resonate with people facing similar challenges. I started small, writing short pieces about specific incidents and insights from my journey. The physical act of putting words on paper, I preferred handwriting to typing, felt similar to drawing. Both required me to observe carefully, to choose what to include and what to leave out, to translate internal experiences into forms that other people could understand. My art class friends became my first readers, offering feedback and encouragement as I developed my voice as a storyteller. Their responses confirmed what Janet had suggested, that my story had value beyond my own personal healing. "This made me cry," said Rose after reading a piece about the day I received the legal documents revealing Michael's theft. But not sad crying, angry crying, the kind that makes you want to do something instead of just accepting whatever happens to you. "You should definitely keep writing," added Patricia. "There are probably thousands of people who need to read this." Fall arrived again, bringing with it the 3rd anniversary of the day I had discovered the truth about Michael's financial abuse. Instead of marking it as a day of trauma, I decided to celebrate it as the beginning of my liberation. I threw myself a small party, nothing elaborate, just cake and coffee with friends who had supported me through the transformation that followed. We toasted not just my survival, but my growth, my newfound independence, my willingness to choose dignity over the illusion of family harmony. "To Mrs. Martinez," Lily said, raising her cup of coffee in a mock toast, "the bravest person I know." "To second chances," added Frank from my art class. "To learning that it's never too late to start over," said Mrs. Chen, her words carrying the weight of her own life experiences. As I looked around the room at these people who had chosen to be in my life rather than feeling obligated to tolerate me, I realized that I had built something far more valuable than the family relationships I had lost. I had created a community based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared interests rather than blood ties and emotional manipulation. The legal restrictions on Michael's contact with me were scheduled to expire that winter, opening the possibility that he might try to re-establish contact. Janet had prepared me for this possibility, discussing strategies for maintaining my boundaries if he attempted to reconcile. "Remember, Mrs. Martinez," she had said, "reconciliation would have to be based on his acknowledgement of what he did and genuine changes in his behavior. Don't let anyone pressure you to forgive just because time has passed." But as the date approached, I found I wasn't particularly anxious about it. The woman who had feared her children's anger and disapproval was gone. If Michael chose to contact me, I would evaluate his approach based on whether it served my interests and well-being rather than his. The phone call came on a Thursday evening in December, almost exactly 3 years after I had first discovered the fraudulent documents. His voice was carefully modulated, designed to sound humble and repentant. "Mom, I know I hurt you," he said without preamble. "I've been thinking about what happened, and I want to make things right between us." The old Margaret would have melted at those words, would have immediately offered forgiveness and reconciliation regardless of whether he had actually changed or was just running low on money again. But I wasn't the old Margaret. "Michael," I said calmly, "what specifically are you apologizing for?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know about the sincerity of his call. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding about your finances. I know you felt like I betrayed your trust." A misunderstanding. After 3 years, that was still how he was characterizing systematic theft from his elderly mother. "Michael, there was no misunderstanding." You forged my signature and stole $50,000 from my accounts. You called me a parasite in open court. Those aren't misunderstandings. They're criminal acts and abusive behavior. Another pause, longer this time. Mom, I think you're remembering things differently than they actually happened. I was trying to help you, and maybe I made some mistakes in how I went about it. But I never meant to hurt you. The gaslighting was subtle but unmistakable. He was trying to convince me that my accurate memories of his behavior were somehow distorted, that his theft had been motivated by concern for my well-being rather than his own greed. Michael, I said, my voice steady and clear, I have court documents that prove exactly what you did. I have bank records that show exactly how much money you stole. I have audio recordings of you calling me a parasite in front of a judge and a room full of witnesses. I'm not misremembering anything. Okay, he said, his tone shifting to irritation as his manipulation failed to work. Let's say I made some serious mistakes. I'm willing to admit that. Can't we find a way to move past this? We're family. Family members don't steal from each other, Michael. Family members don't forge signatures or lie in court or call their mothers parasites. You chose to end our relationship when you chose to abuse me. I've simply accepted your choice. I hung up the phone and went back to the book I had been reading, a mystery novel that was far more engaging than Michael's predictable attempts at reconciliation. The call didn't upset me the way it would have years earlier. If anything, it confirmed that I had made the right decision in cutting off contact. He showed no understanding of what he had done, no genuine remorse, no indication that he saw me as anything other than a resource he wanted to access again. Sarah tried next, calling a few weeks later with a more sophisticated approach. Mom, Michael told me he called you. I know things have been difficult between you all, but I'm worried about you being alone, especially during the holidays. I'm not alone, Sarah. I have friends, activities, a full life. I'm probably less alone now than I was when I was waiting for phone calls that never came and visits that were always canceled. But we're your children. Don't you miss having family in your life? The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because the answer was so clear. Sarah, you haven't been family to me in any meaningful way for years. You've been people who called when you needed something and disappeared when I needed something. That's not what family means. Mom, that's not fair. We've always loved you. Love isn't just a word, Sarah. It's actions. It's showing up. It's treating someone with respect and consideration. When did you last demonstrate love for me in any way that cost you something or inconvenienced you? She couldn't answer the question because we both knew the answer was never. I've built a new life, I continued. A life filled with people who enjoy my company, who value my opinions, who treat me like a person rather than an obligation. I'm happier now than I've been in decades. After I hung up, I realized that I had spoken nothing but truth. The fear of losing my children that had kept me trapped in abusive relationships for years had been based on an illusion. I had already lost them long before I chose to protect myself from their abuse. What I had gained in the process of letting go was far more valuable than what I had lost. The holiday season that year was the best I could remember in decades. Instead of waiting for phone calls and counting disappointments, I had a calendar full of activities with people who genuinely wanted to spend time with me. I attended a Christmas concert at the senior center, joined friends for a New Year's Eve dinner at a neighborhood restaurant, and spent quiet evenings at home reading books I enjoyed and working on art projects that brought me satisfaction. On Christmas morning, I received cards from my art class friends, from Lily and her grandmother, from Janet and several of the social workers I had met at the charity event. Each card contained personal messages acknowledging our friendship and expressing gratitude for my presence in their lives. No cards came from Michael or Sarah, but for the first time, their absence didn't hurt. I had filled the space they had left with people who actually cared about my well-being rather than my usefulness. As I sit here now, writing these final words on a sunny afternoon in my yellow-curtained apartment, I think about the journey that brought me from that dark kitchen table, where I used to wait for texts that never came, to this bright space, filled with evidence of a life lived on my own terms. The walls now display my artwork alongside photographs from my travels with the senior group. My bookshelf contains novels I chose because they interested me, not because someone else recommended them. My calendar is marked with activities I selected based on what brings me joy rather than what others expect from me. I sleep well at night, no longer afraid of financial insecurity or wondering whether I'll have enough money to pay my bills. I wake up each morning with plans that belong to me, with friends who value my company, with artistic projects that express who I am rather than who others want me to be. The trust money that Michael tried to steal now helps other elderly people escape financial abuse and rebuild their lives. The inheritance he felt entitled to serves people who have experienced situations similar to mine, providing them with legal assistance and support services they need to break free from exploitative family relationships. Sometimes I wonder if he understands what he lost when he chose theft over relationship. The woman who would have left him $500,000 was also the woman who would have been there for him during difficult times, who would have celebrated his successes and supported him through failures without keeping score or expecting payment. But that woman existed only as long as she was respected and valued. When she was treated as nothing more than a source of money and labor, she disappeared, replaced by someone with boundaries and self-respect. I don't regret the choice I made in that courtroom. I don't regret dissolving the trust or cutting off contact with my children. I don't regret prioritizing my own dignity over their comfort. The only thing I regret is waiting so long to value myself as much as I valued them. If you're listening to this story and recognizing parts of your own life, if you're being treated as a bank account rather than a person, if your generosity is being exploited by people who claim to love you, if you're afraid to set boundaries because you fear being alone, I want you to know that you deserve better. You deserve to be treated with respect by the people in your life. You deserve to have your sacrifices acknowledged rather than taken for granted. You deserve relationships based on mutual care rather than one-sided giving. And if the people in your life aren't capable of treating you with basic human dignity, you deserve the peace and freedom that come from walking away. It took me 71 years to learn that lesson. I hope it doesn't take you that long. The courtroom is quiet now, the gasps of shock long faded into memory. But the strength I found that day, the voice I discovered when I finally chose myself over the illusion of family harmony, remains with me every morning when I wake up in my bright apartment, every evening when I sit by the window watching the sun set over the city I love. I am no longer a parasite in anyone's story. I am the author of my own life, the artist of my own happiness, the architect of my own peace. And that, my friends, is worth more than any inheritance I could have left behind. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, constantly giving to family members who take your generosity for granted? Have you experienced the painful realization that the people you love most might see you as nothing more than a resource to be exploited? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is share our experiences with people who understand. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships or inspired you to set boundaries you've been afraid to establish, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. It will help me reach other people who might need to hear this message, other people who deserve to know that it's never too late to choose dignity over dysfunction, self-respect over family obligation. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for allowing me to open my heart to you. And remember, you are worth fighting for, even if you have to fight the people closest to you to prove it.